The moment Calvin Walker's boots hit the platform at Millhaven Station, and he saw the train pulling away without Lucy Hawthorne stepping off it, something inside him cracked open like dry earth splitting under a summer drought. And for the first time in 32 years of hard living, the man who had never once cried felt the hot, shameful burn of tears sliding down his weathered face. But that was not where the story began. It began 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, when the town of Millhaven, Texas was still quiet enough that you could hear the mockingbirds arguing in the mesquite trees along the creek bed. Calvin Walker rode into town the way he always did, straight-backed in the saddle on his buckskin mare named Duchess, hat pulled low against the early light, and jaw set like a man who had decided long ago that the world owed him nothing and expected nothing in return. He was a man of few words, fewer smiles, and absolutely no tears. The other cowhands at the Rocking T Ranch, where he worked as foreman, liked to say that Calvin Walker had been carved from West Texas limestone, because nothing moved him and nothing broke him, and he had been standing in the same hard place for as long as anyone could remember. He was 32 years old. He owned a small parcel of land 3 miles outside Millhaven, 40 head of cattle, and a one-room house he had built with his own hands. He had no family left to speak of, his mother having passed from fever when he was 14 and his father having drunk himself into a grave 2 years after that. He had raised himself on grit and cattle work, and he had long since made peace with the fact that his life was a solitary one. He had not, however, made peace with being lonely. That was a different thing entirely, and Calvin understood the difference even if he never said it out loud. He was in Millhaven that Tuesday morning to collect a saddle he had left with the leather worker, a stout and cheerful man named Edmund Briggs, who ran his shop beside the post office on the main street. Calvin tied Duchess to the post outside, ducked under the low awning, and pushed through the door into the warm smell of oiled leather and beeswax. Edmund was not alone. Standing at the counter with her back partially turned was a young woman Calvin had never seen before in Millhaven, and in a town of 412 souls, that was something worth noticing. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a travel-worn bonnet, a dress that had clearly seen several days of hard traveling, and a posture that suggested she was not going to let any of that diminish her. She was speaking to Edmund in a clear, unhurried voice, asking about a Mrs. Patricia Holly's on Sycamore Road. Edmund scratched the back of his neck. "Mrs. Holly's passed on last winter, ma'am. I hate to be the one to tell you that." The young woman went very still. Calvin saw the slight drop in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened on the small leather bag she was holding, and then the way she deliberately pulled herself back up again. "I see," she said, and her voice was composed in the way that people are composed only when they are working very hard at it. Calvin set his hat back on his head and waited, because it was not his business, and he was not a man who inserted himself into other people's trouble. But then Edmund caught his eye and did what Edmund always did, which was precisely the thing that made awkward situations more awkward. "Miss, this here is Calvin Walker. He knows near everyone in the county." "Calvin, this young lady says she's come down from St. Louis. Maybe you can point her somewhere she can get her bearings." Calvin looked at the woman properly for the first time. She turned to face him, and he saw brown eyes the color of dark river water, a few freckles across the bridge of her nose that the sun had put there, and an expression on her face that was equal parts exhaustion and determination. She was not what anyone in Millhaven would have called fragile. "Lucy Hawthorne," she said, and extended her hand like she expected him to shake it, which was not the usual thing for a woman to do in Millhaven in 1883, but Calvin found he had no objection to it whatsoever. He shook her hand. "Calvin Walker," he said. "Mrs. Holly's was my mother's cousin," Lucy explained, as if she had decided that directness was the best policy with this tall, quiet man. "I have been corresponding with her for several months. I had planned to stay with her while I found work as a schoolteacher. The county has an open position, I was told. Calvin knew about the position. The schoolteacher, a gentleman from Ohio named Mr. Farley, had packed up and left Millhaven 3 months ago after a disagreement with the school board about the proper way to teach arithmetic, and the position had been empty since. He also knew that Lucy Hawthorne had just arrived in a town where she knew no one, with a dead contact and nowhere to stay, and that the afternoon stage would not return to San Antonio until Thursday. He was not the kind of man who usually offered things. But something about the straightforward steadiness in her eyes made him speak before he had fully decided to. "The boarding house on Front Street has decent rooms," he said. "Mrs. Granby runs it. She's strict about noise after 9 and expects payment on Mondays, but she's fair." Lucy looked at him with a measuring expression, as though she was deciding whether his information was reliable. Apparently she decided it was. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." He picked up his saddle from Edmund, nodded, and left. He thought about her eyes 3 separate times before he made it back to the rocking tee. The school board held its meeting about the teaching position the following Friday evening at the Millhaven Courthouse, a low adobe building that also served as the mayor's office and the sheriff's records room on alternating days of the week. Calvin was on the school board, a fact that had come about not because he had any particular passion for education, but because the previous member had ridden off to Arizona and someone needed to fill the seat. He was on the board in the same way he was on the church deacon committee and the civic water committee, which was to say that someone had asked him, and he had not said no fast enough. He arrived to find Lucy Hawthorne already seated across the table from the other board members, which included Edmund Briggs, the town Dr. William Haskell, and a rancher named George Pratt who owned more land than sense. She had changed into a clean dress of dark blue cotton, and her hair was down from the severe travel pins into something softer at the edges. She had brought with her a letter of reference from the St. Louis School District, and a small notebook in which she had written a curriculum outline that she set on the table in front of the board with the confidence of a woman who had done her homework. George Pratt asked her 3 questions, 2 of which were condescending and 1 of which was simply rude. Lucy answered all 3 with such precise and knowledgeable calm that George had nothing left to say and spent the rest of the interview staring at the table. Calvin asked her only 1 question. "What do you believe is the most important thing a child can learn?" She did not hesitate. "That they matter," she said. "Everything else follows from that." The board voted 3-1 in favor of hiring her, with George Pratt casting the single dissenting vote on the grounds that she was from out of state, which was not a legal reason to reject a candidate, and everyone in the room knew it. Lucy Hawthorne became the schoolteacher of Millhaven, Texas, on the 1st of April, 1883. Calvin Walker did not speak to her again for 11 days, because he had a ranch to run and cattle to move, and a fence line along the north pasture that had been giving him trouble since February. But he was aware of her in the way that you become aware of something that has changed in your field of vision, the way a new tree planted in a familiar yard suddenly becomes the thing your eye goes to without your permission. He heard about her from Edmund, who said she had repainted the inside of the schoolhouse herself on a Saturday morning, with paint she had purchased from her first week's wages. He heard about her from Mrs. Granby, who had been skeptical of a single woman from the city, but had come around to admiring the fact that Lucy was always the first one up in the morning and kept her room immaculate. He heard about her from the children at the rocking tee, whose older ones attended her school and came home talking about the maps she had put up on the wall, and the way she read stories aloud with different voices for different characters. It was at the church social on the 14th of April that he spoke to her again. The social was held on the grass behind the Baptist church, with long tables of covered dishes and a fiddle player named Old Pete, who could make a crowd dance whether they intended to or not. Calvin attended because his ranch hand Roberto Vargas had asked him to come, and Roberto was a man who had worked beside Calvin for 7 years and was therefore owed certain considerations. Lucy was there with Mrs. Granby and two of the other women from the boarding house. She was eating a piece of cornbread and listening to old Pete with an expression of genuine pleasure on her face, her head tilted slightly, one foot tapping in the grass beneath her skirt. Calvin noticed the foot tapping and found he was smiling before he realized he was doing it. Roberto nudged him. "You are staring, Hefe." Calvin stopped staring. He went and got himself a plate of food and spent 20 minutes talking to the sheriff, a patient man named Harold Booker, about the cattle market in San Antonio. Then he walked in the general direction of the lemonade pitcher, which happened to bring him within conversational distance of Lucy Hawthorne. She saw him first. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Miss Hawthorne," he poured himself a cup of lemonade. "How are you settling in?" "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "The children are wonderful, even the difficult ones." "Billy Pratt giving you trouble?" George Pratt's son had a reputation that preceded him into most rooms. A smile broke across her face, and it was a real smile, the kind that involved her whole face and made her eyes go bright. "He put a frog in my desk drawer on Wednesday," she said. "I put it in a jar with some grass, and we spent the rest of the afternoon discussing the life cycle of amphibians. He has not misbehaved since." Calvin stared at her. "That is the cleverest thing I have heard in some time. I learned early on," she said, "that the best way to deal with mischief is to make it useful." They talked for another 20 minutes while old Pete played, and the sun went down over the flat Texas horizon in layers of orange and rose. And Calvin learned that Lucy Hawthorne was the daughter of a schoolteacher herself, that her father had died when she was 16 and her mother had remarried and moved to Ohio with a man Lucy described only as perfectly adequate, and that she had spent 6 years teaching in St. Louis before deciding she wanted something different, something with more sky. She had written to Patricia Hollies, the only distant relative she had in the West, and the rest had followed. "Were you not frightened," he asked, "coming to a place where you had never been with a single contact who turned out to be gone?" Lucy considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I was frightened on the train," she admitted, "for about an hour somewhere in New Mexico. But then the sun came up and I could see the desert, and it was so large and so indifferent to my fear that I realized my fear was simply too small for the landscape." She paused. "Does that sound strange?" "No," Calvin said. "It sounds exactly right." He rode home that night under a sky that was all stars and no clouds, and he felt something shifting inside him, the way rock shifts after a long freeze and a thaw, slow and deep and irreversible. He came to the church social the following month with a reason to go, which was different from having a reason to stay. Through May and into June, Calvin and Lucy found ways to be in each other's company with the reasonable frequency of two people who lived in the same small town, and both took an interest in its welfare. He helped repair the schoolhouse roof when a spring hailstorm damaged it, alongside 4 other men from town, but it was Lucy who brought out cold water and a sensible system for distributing the shingles that made the whole job go twice as fast. She thanked each man individually and by name, and Calvin noticed that she looked at him a moment longer than the others, or perhaps he only imagined that. He asked her in the middle of June if she would like to see his land. He had not planned to ask. He was in town to pick up a delivery of wire from the hardware store, and Lucy was coming out of the post office with a stack of letters, and the words came out before he had reviewed them. "I have 40 acres of decent grazing land 3 miles out. Good view of the creek and the hills. Thought you might like to see it, given that you came out here for the sky." She looked up at him from under the brim of her bonnet. He could not read her expression precisely, but it was not displeased. "I would like that very much," she said. "Sunday afternoon. Sunday afternoon." He spent the rest of the week not thinking about it, which required a great deal of energy. She arrived at his gate on Sunday at 2 o'clock on a borrowed horse from the livery stable, sitting in the saddle with the competence of someone who had learned young and kept it up. He had not expected that. He had half imagined he would need to lead her horse for her, and the picture he had of himself doing that now seemed faintly absurd. "You can ride," he said, and she laughed, and the laugh was low and easy and real. "My father taught me when I was 7, she said. He believed a woman who could ride her own horse was less dependent on the goodwill of men. Calvin turned that over in his mind as they rode out together across the short grass toward the hills. Sounds like a wise man. He was, she said simply, and the simplicity of it told him that she missed her father deeply and had made her peace with it and did not need comfort, only acknowledgement. He gave her that acknowledgement in the form of silence, which was the form he was best at, and she seemed to understand it perfectly. He showed her the creek first, because the creek was where the cottonwood trees grew, and in June the cottonwoods were full and green against the dry brown land, and the sound of the water was the best sound on the property. Then he showed her the north pasture where the grass was still good, and his cattle moving slowly through it in the afternoon heat, and the small hill at the property's edge where you could see 4 miles in every direction, and the sky seemed to go on without a ceiling. Lucy stood on top of that hill and looked out for a long time without speaking. "There it is," she said finally, "the sky I came for." Calvin stood a few feet away and watched her watching it and felt something in his chest that he had no adequate word for. It was not longing, exactly. It was more like recognition, like seeing a thing you had not known was missing and finding that it had been there all along, just waiting in the right weather to become visible. He drove her back to Millhaven in the early evening, and he did not take her hand or say anything that was directly about the way he felt, because he was Calvin Walker and direct declarations were not in his natural vocabulary. But when she stepped down from the wagon in front of the boarding house and turned to say good night, she held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for a farewell, and he thought that perhaps she was saying something in that look that he would take the rest of the week to translate. He took the rest of the week to translate it and concluded that she had been. He brought her wildflowers the following Saturday, a loose bundle of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush that he had gathered from the creek bank, tied with a piece of twine. He knocked on the boarding house door and handed them to her when she answered, and she looked at the flowers and then at his face, and her mouth curved into the softest smile he had ever seen. "Calvin Walker," she said. "Lucy Hawthorne," he said, and that was all either of them said about it that day. But when he left, he was walking 3 inches taller than usual, and Mrs. Granby, watching from her parlor window, made a very satisfied noise into her teacup. The summer of 1883 unfolded around them with the generosity of a season that knows its own importance. They took afternoon rides together on Sundays. They sat together at the church social in July, and Calvin danced with her once slowly, at the edge of the dancing ground while old Pete played a waltz, and she danced well, and he danced adequately, and neither of them cared about the difference. They had supper at the hotel dining room twice, which in Millhaven constituted a notable public event, and generated 3 separate conversations at the general store about whether Calvin Walker was finally, at long last, stepping out with someone. He was. He was stepping out with her, and it was the best thing that had happened to him in his adult life, and he knew it with the quiet certainty of a man who has learned not to mistake what is real for what is only hoped for. In August, they sat on the porch of his house in the early evening, and she told him about St. Louis. She told him about the cramped schoolroom in the South District where she had taught, and the children who came to school hungry and the ones who came without shoes in winter. She told him about the city noise and the river smell, and the way you could live in a place for years and never quite belong to it. She told him about the loneliness of being a single woman in a city that had no particular use for single women who were not looking for husbands. "Were you not looking for a husband?" Calvin asked, and then immediately felt the question was too much, but Lucy did not flinch from it. "I was looking for a life first," she said. "I thought the right life might eventually include the right person." Calvin looked out at the flat, darkening land. "I believe that is a very sensible order of operations," he said carefully. She turned to look at him, and her brown eyes were soft and direct and honest. "And you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment because the question deserved a genuine answer and not a deflection. "I have had this land and this work for 10 years," he said, "and I have been glad of both. But there is a kind of silence that is good and a kind of silence that is just empty. For a long while I did not know the difference." He paused. "I believe I am learning to tell them apart." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the porch chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that while the last light went out of the sky. He kissed her for the first time in September on the hill at the edge of his property, after they had stood watching a hawk circling over the creek for 10 minutes without speaking. It was not a dramatic thing. It was quiet and unhurried, and she kissed him back with the same steady certainty she brought to everything she did, and afterward she rested her forehead against his jaw for a moment, and he kept very still and breathed. "Well," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. By October they were understood by all of Millhaven to be a couple, and Calvin was thinking about things he had not allowed himself to think about before. He was thinking about the house and how it might be larger if he added a second room, and about the school and whether it was close enough to ride to on a good morning, and about a ring he had seen in the window of the jeweler in San Marcos when he had passed through on cattle business in late September. It was a simple thing, a thin gold band with a small turquoise stone that reminded him of the color of the sky after a good rain, and he had stood outside the window looking at it for 2 minutes before walking on. Then in October, the letter came. Lucy received it on a Thursday afternoon, and Calvin did not know about it until Friday evening when he came to town for the weekly supplies and stopped at the boarding house to ask if she wanted to walk. Mrs. Granby answered the door with the careful expression of a woman who has seen trouble coming and does not know how to prepare someone else for it. "She's in her room," Mrs. Granby said quietly. "She received a letter from back east." Calvin went up the narrow staircase and knocked on her door, and when she opened it her eyes were red at the edges, which was the only indication she allowed herself. She let him in and he sat in the chair by the window and she stood by the small table where the letter lay open. "It is from my mother," she said. "Her husband, the man she married, has fallen gravely ill. She is asking me to come home." She paused. "To Ohio." Calvin said nothing because there was nothing to say until she had said everything. "She says she cannot manage alone," Lucy continued. "She says she needs me there to help with the house and the business. He runs a dry goods business in Columbus." She picked up the letter and put it down again. "She says it may only be a few months, until he recovers or until they can arrange proper household help." "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked at him with eyes that were fighting to stay clear. "I want to stay here," she said simply. "This is where I want to be, but she is my mother." Calvin understood obligation. He had been raised by nothing except the understanding that when something was owed, you paid it, and when someone needed you, you went. He nodded slowly. "Then you should go," he said. "Calvin, you should go," he said again gently. "She is your mother. A few months is not forever." Lucy crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. "I am afraid," she said, "that if I leave I will lose what I have found here." He moved from the chair and sat beside her and took her hands in both of his. She was 25 years old and she had traveled 1,000 miles alone and built herself a life in a strange town on pure courage, and she was sitting here afraid of losing him, and the magnitude of that struck him somewhere in the center of his chest with the force of something very real. "You cannot lose me," he said. "I will be here. I have been standing in this county for a long time. A few months is not going to change the ground under my feet." She looked at him. He could see her deciding whether to believe that, whether it was safe to believe it. "Write to me," he said, "every week. And I will write back." "You would write letters," she said, and there was the beginning of a genuine smile in her voice. "I would write letters," he confirmed. "I am not known for my correspondence, but I am capable of it when the cause is sufficient." She laughed then, briefly and softly, and leaned into him, and he put his arm around her and they sat like that while the October wind moved through the gap under the window. She made her arrangements over the following week. the school board agreed to hire a temporary replacement, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Belton from Fredericksburg, who was willing to take the position for 4 months. Lucy settled her account with Mrs. Granby, who made her promise to write and then made her promise again for good measure. Roberto Vargas's wife, Elena, packed Lucy a basket of food for the train and cried without embarrassment while handing it over. Calvin drove her to the station in Millhaven on the 1st of November, 1883. It was a cold, gray morning, and the platform was nearly empty except for a few cowhands heading south and an older couple from the hill country who were going to see their grandchildren. He helped her with her 2 bags, and they stood on the platform while the train sat steaming at the end of the track. He had the ring in his coat pocket. He had gone back to the jeweler in San Marcos 2 weeks before and bought it, and it had been in his pocket ever since, and he had been waiting for the right moment, which had apparently not arrived until now, which was not the right moment at all. He turned it over in his fingers inside his pocket and said nothing. "I will write you from Columbus as soon as I arrive," she said. She was looking up at him with those clear brown eyes, and her chin was steady and her voice was composed, but she was holding his hand with both of hers and her grip was tight. "I know you will," he said, "and you will write back. I will write back." She looked at him as though she was memorizing him, and he returned the look, and then the train whistle sounded its 2-note warning, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw for a moment, and then she picked up her bag and walked to the car. He stood on the platform and watched the train until it was gone beyond the rise where the tracks bent south. He drove home. He went inside and sat at the table and looked at the ring in his palm for a long time. Then he put it back in his pocket and went out to work, because work was the only language available to him for what he was feeling. The letters began arriving in late November. Lucy wrote well and honestly, as he had expected she would. She described Columbus, which was a proper city with brick buildings and paved streets and electric street lamps that had recently been installed, and which she found remarkable. She described her mother's husband, whose name was Richard Oakes, as a decent man who was genuinely ill with a lung condition that the doctors were treating with some optimism. She described her mother, whom she called Adeline, as a woman who had spent so long deferring to her husband that she had partially forgotten how to act independently. She was teaching her mother, she wrote with dry humor, in much the same way she taught the children. She described missing the sky. Calvin wrote back in his careful, spare way. He told her about the cattle and the ranch and the fence that had finally been fixed. He told her about the mild winter they were having and about Roberto and Elena's new baby, a boy they had named Diego who had arrived in December with a healthy set of lungs. He told her about the schoolchildren and Mrs. Belton's progress, and about Billy Pratt, who had apparently decided that good behavior was more interesting than bad and was now, according to reports, the best student in the arithmetic class. He wrote to her about the land and the sky, and the way the creek looked in winter when the water ran shallow and clear over the pale stones. He wrote to her about the silence, and how it was the good kind now mostly, because the empty kind had company in it, which was the closest he could come in a letter to saying what he actually meant. She understood anyway. Her reply letter said simply, in the middle of a paragraph about other things, "I feel the same way. The empty kind has company now. I find that bearable." December passed. January arrived with a cold front that was unusual for Central Texas, and Calvin spent 2 hard weeks checking on his cattle in the thin, bitter wind. He wrote to Lucy about the cold, and she wrote back that Columbus was buried in snow, proper Midwestern snow, and that she had always loved the look of it but found the reality somewhat less romantic. In February, her letter was shorter than usual and her handwriting was tighter. Richard Oakes had worsened. The doctor was less optimistic now. Her mother was managing better, practically speaking, but was frightened, and Lucy was staying close to the house. Calvin wrote back. He told her he was thinking of her. He told her to take the time she needed and that the land would be here and he would be here, both of them waiting. In March, Richard Oakes died. Lucy's letter about it arrived at the end of March, and it was the saddest letter she had written, not because she had been close to Richard Oakes, who was, as she had said, perfectly adequate, but because of what it meant. Her mother was a widow in a city she had moved to for another person's life, and the dry goods business needed to be settled, and there were lawyers and accounts and arrangements, and Lucy was the only one who could manage it. She wrote that she expected to be in Columbus for at least another 2 months. That made it May. She had been gone since November. Calvin understood. He sat with her letter for a long time and then wrote back and said he understood, and that he hoped she was managing, and that he was thinking of her, and that the bluebonnets were coming in along the creek, and he had been watching them and thinking that she would want to see them, and that they would still be there if she came in May. It was also in March that the situation with the Rocking T Ranch became complicated. Calvin had worked as foreman there for 8 years, and the owner, a man named Daniel Thornton, had always been fair. But Daniel Thornton's son, a man named Preston Thornton who was 28 and had spent most of that 28 years in Dallas and San Antonio, returned to Millhaven in March with ideas about the ranch that involved reducing the crew, increasing the cattle load beyond what the land could comfortably sustain, and specifically, replacing Calvin with a man Preston had brought from Dallas named Hargrove. This was within Preston Thornton's legal right, as Daniel Thornton had transferred management of the ranch to his son in February due to his own declining health. Calvin took the news with the same stillness he took most things, thanked Daniel Thornton for 8 years of honest work and fair pay, shook the man's hand, and left the Rocking T for the last time on a Thursday afternoon in late March. It was not a disaster. He had his own land, his own cattle, and 7 years of savings. But it was a change, and change in March when the woman you loved was still 2 months away from coming home was the kind of thing that sat heavy on a man's chest in the evenings. He threw himself into his own land. He expanded the cattle operation, buying 12 more head from a rancher outside Fredericksburg who was selling off a portion of his herd. He repaired the barn with wood he had been saving. He started building the second room onto the house, the one he had been thinking about since October, because work was the best answer to uncertainty, and because the room would be needed eventually, and he was a man who believed in being ready. Roberto Vargas came to help him with the building on Saturdays, with baby Diego strapped to Alina's chest nearby, and Roberto talked while Calvin worked, which was the natural order of their friendship, and Calvin was grateful for it. Roberto asked about Lucy in the frank and uncomplicated way of a man who considered himself a friend to both parties. Calvin told him about the letters and the delays, and Roberto listened and nodded and handed him nails when he needed them. "She is coming back," Roberto said, on a Saturday in April when they were framing the new room. "She said she would be here in May," Calvin replied. Roberto looked at him with the particular expression he reserved for when Calvin was being stubborn about something. "I did not mean only in the practical sense," he said. Calvin drove a nail into the frame. "I know that. She writes you every week." "Yes. A woman who is not coming back does not write every week." "I know, Roberto." Roberto smiled and went back to work satisfied. The letters from Lucy in April were longer again. The business was nearly settled. Her mother was grieving but steadier. A cousin of Richard Oakes had taken over the management of the dry goods store, which relieved the financial pressure. Lucy wrote that she had begun to feel in Columbus the same sense of not quite belonging that she had felt in St. Louis, the sense of being a visitor in someone else's life, and that she was ready to come home. She used that word, home. Not Millhaven, but home, and Calvin read it sitting at his kitchen table with his coffee gone cold, and he felt the tightness in his chest ease in a way it had not eased since November. She wrote that she would book passage on the train south as soon as her mother was settled, and that she expected to arrive in Millhaven on the 23rd of May. Calvin wrote back immediately with more words than he usually managed in a single letter. He told her about the cattle, and the new room and Roberto and Diego, and the bluebonnets at the creek. He told her that Mrs. Granby had kept her room open on the grounds that no one else's things would look right in it. He told her that the school board wanted her back, and that Mrs. Belton, who was 73 and had been teaching for 50 years, was ready to retire for the actual last time. He told her at the end of the letter, because he had been holding it back for months, and the distance from March to May felt suddenly too long to wait, that he had something he wanted to ask her when she returned. He said nothing more about what that something was, because some things should be said in person, face to face, on solid ground. He sealed the letter and rode into town to post it, and rode back and went to check on his cattle, and thought about the 23rd of May with a concentrated intensity that was entirely new to him. The 23rd of May arrived after a spring that had been beautiful by any standard. The bluebonnets had come in thick and blue along the creek, and the air was warm without being harsh, and the evening smelled of grass and cedar, and Millhaven was in the kind of ease that small Texas towns can achieve in the weeks between the cold and the heat, when everything is exactly right. Calvin put on his good shirt and his clean hat on the morning of the 23rd. He brushed Duchess and hitched her to the wagon with more attention than usual. The ring had been in his jacket pocket for 6 months, and he moved it that morning to his shirt pocket, closer, where he could feel it. Roberto shook his hand that morning when he stopped by the Walker land with a fence question, and then laughed at the formality of the gesture and shook his hand again more warmly. Alina came out and pressed a jar of preserved apricots into Calvin's hands and told him in rapid Spanish that he was a good man and that Lucy Hawthorne was lucky, and Roberto translated the last part into English, and Calvin thanked her with the awkward sincerity of a man who rarely received compliments and was not sure how to hold them. He arrived at Millhaven Station at 20 minutes before noon. The train from San Antonio, which had originated in Columbus with a connection in St. Louis and another in Oklahoma City, was scheduled to arrive at past noon. He tied Duchess at the hitching post beside the station and walked onto the platform and stood in the clean, bright air and watched the southern tracks. The station master, a thin man named Arthur Price, came out and checked his pocket watch and told Calvin the train was running on schedule. "Good," Calvin said. He stood straight-backed on the platform with his hat in his hands, which was not his usual manner, and felt the ring in his shirt pocket against his chest. past noon came. The station master came back out. He looked at his watch and then down the track and then back at Calvin with an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "She is a few minutes late," he said. "Not unusual." Calvin nodded. He put his hat back on. 1:15. The station master came and went twice more. A rancher from the East County arrived and waited for a freight delivery and made conversation that Calvin answered in 2-word increments while watching the tracks. 1 o'clock. The train had not come. At 1:30, the telegraph machine in the station office began to click, and Arthur Price went inside and stayed there for several minutes and came back out with a piece of paper in his hand and the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "I have a communication from the San Antonio office." Calvin turned to look at him. Arthur Price looked at the paper, which was a telegraph from the station master in San Antonio relaying information from further up the line. The train had arrived in San Antonio. All passengers had disembarked in San Antonio. There was no Miss Hawthorne listed among the passengers who had continued north on the Millhaven branch. She had not gotten on the train. Calvin stood very still on the platform for a long moment. The afternoon light was falling at the particular angle that makes the Texas plains look both vast and intimate, and the mockingbirds were arguing in the mesquites across the road, and somewhere down the street a wagon wheel creaked, and none of it sounded quite right. She had not gotten on the train. He did not know what had happened. He did not know if she was all right. He did not know if her mother had taken ill again, or if there had been an accident, or if something had changed that he had no information about, and the not knowing was its own particular category of suffering that he was wholly unprepared for. He realized, standing there on the empty platform staring down the silent tracks, that his face was wet. He reached up and touched his cheek with 2 fingers and confirmed that this was the case, and the confirmation was so startling that for a moment he could not process it. Calvin Walker, who had buried his mother at 14 and his father at 16, and had ridden through 3 droughts and 1 bad year when the cattle market collapsed, and had once sat with a dying ranch hand through a long night without any expression crossing his face except steadiness, was standing on the Millhaven train platform in broad daylight with tears running down his face. He stood there and let it happen, because there was nothing else to do, and because the tears were not weakness. He understood that now. They were simply the truest thing he had felt in 32 years, rising to the surface and refusing to be contained. And Lucy Hawthorne was the reason they were there. And that fact alone, even in the middle of the fear and the uncertainty, told him something important about what she had done to him and what that meant. Arthur Price looked away with the tactful discretion of a good man and found something to do inside the station office. Calvin stood on the platform for 10 more minutes. Then he dried his face on his bandana, put his hat straight on his head, and walked into the station to send a telegraph. He sent it to the Columbus Western Union office, addressed to Miss Lucy Hawthorne, care of Mrs. Adeline Oakes, on the return address she had sent him months before. The message was 6 words because 6 was all that the situation required and all that he had. It said, "Are you safe? I am here." He drove back to his house in the silence of a man who has given himself over entirely to waiting, which is perhaps the hardest discipline there is. The telegraph reply came 2 days later on the 25th of May, and Arthur Price sent his boy running out to the Walker property with it at 7 in the morning. Calvin read it standing by the barn. The message from Lucy Hawthorne said, "I am safe. Mother collapsed. She is recovering. I could not leave. I am so sorry, Calvin. I will write." He breathed. She was safe. She was safe, and she had not been able to come, and she was sorry. And the relief and the sorrow mixed together in his chest in a complicated way that he did not try to untangle. He sent a reply immediately, riding to town himself to do it. "I am glad you are safe. Take the time you need. I am still here. I am not going anywhere." The letter she sent arrived a week after the telegraph. She had been preparing to leave on the 23rd when her mother, who was still fragile from the grief and the strain of the months before, had fainted in the kitchen and struck her head on the edge of the table. The injury was minor but had frightened the doctor, who wanted Adeline monitored for at least 2 weeks. Lucy had gone to the station and stood on the platform and made the decision that she could not go. She had sent word through the station master when it was too late for a telegraph to reach Calvin before the train arrived. The letter was the most emotionally direct thing she had ever written him. She wrote about standing on the Columbus platform watching the train leave without her, knowing he was waiting at the other end, and about the specific quality of that helplessness, and about being afraid that his patience was not infinite, and about being afraid that she had found the best thing and was somehow losing it by virtue of being a good daughter. She wrote, "I know you said you would be there, and I believe you, but I want you to know that I am coming back, Calvin. I am coming back because that land and that sky and you are the first things I have ever had that felt entirely mine, and I am not going to lose that. I am not a woman who loses what is hers." Calvin read that letter sitting on the porch of his house in the late evening with the sound of the creek carrying in the warm air, and he felt the tightness in his chest ease again, deeper this time, and he sat there for a long while with the letter in his hand, and the stars coming up one by one over the hills. He wrote back the same night, by lamplight, in the longest and most deliberate letter he had ever composed. He told her about the platform and the train that had not come, and standing there in the afternoon light, and he did not try to make it smaller than it was. He told her he had wept, which was a fact he would not have admitted to any other living soul, and that it had surprised him, and that he understood now what it meant, that it meant she had gotten into a place in him that was beyond composure, and that he was glad she was there. He told her about the ring. He told her about the jeweler's window in San Marcos the previous September and how he had walked past it twice, and about riding back to San Marcos in October to buy it, and about carrying it in his pocket for 6 months and nearly asking her on the platform in November, and deciding it was not the right moment. He told her it was still in his pocket, had been in his pocket every day since October, and that it would stay there until she came back, and when she came back, he intended to ask her properly on the hill at the edge of his land with the sky all around them, and that the only answer he could accept was yes. He rode into town at midnight to post the letter because he did not want to wait until morning. Adeline Oakes recovered from her fainting spell within 10 days, as the doctor had predicted. The cousin who had taken over the dry goods store agreed to check in on her weekly. 2 women from Adeline's church stepped forward to provide regular company and practical help. Lucy had, in the month since November, done what she had always done, which was to build a sustainable system around a problem rather than simply filling the gap herself indefinitely. By the 2nd week of June, there was a structure in place that did not require Lucy's permanent presence. She booked her ticket for the 14th of June. She sent Calvin a telegraph first, because neither of them wanted a repeat of May. The telegraph arrived on the 9th of June, and Calvin held it in both hands and read it 4 times. Arriving Millhaven 14 June noon train. I am coming home. He told Roberto, who told Elena, who apparently told everyone in Millhaven within 48 hours. Because by the 12th of June, Mrs. Granby had aired out Lucy's room, put fresh flowers on the windowsill, and informed the school board of the return date, and old Pete had started practicing a welcoming tune, and Edmund Briggs had baked something, which was unusual enough that several people stopped to ask him about it. Calvin spent the 13th of June doing ordinary things with extraordinary difficulty. He checked his cattle. He repaired a section of fence that did not urgently need repairing. He made sure the new room on the house was finished and clean, which it was. He stood on the hill at the edge of his property in the late afternoon and looked out at the 4-mile view and the sky going gold and thought about everything that had happened in the 8 months since a young woman with auburn hair and brown eyes had walked into Edmund Briggs's leather shop carrying a travel bag and looking for a dead woman's address. He took the ring out of his shirt pocket and held it in the light for a moment. The turquoise stone caught the evening sun, and the color of it was exactly, perfectly, the color of the sky after rain. He put it back and went inside. He was at Millhaven Station on the 14th of June at 11 in the morning, 1 full hour before the train was due, and Arthur Price gave him a knowing look and made sure to be visible near the telegraph machine in case it was needed, but his expression was optimistic. At noon, the track curved at the southern rise and the train appeared. Calvin stood very still on the platform and watched it come in, and something in him that had been braced and held tight since November slowly, carefully, released. The train came to a full stop with a great exhale of steam, and the conductor stepped down, and people began to emerge from the cars, and Calvin was watching the second car because it was the one the conductor had indicated when Calvin had asked, very casually, which car the through passengers from the south typically used. He had his hat in his hands again, same as May, but his face was composed in the way a face is composed when the thing it has been waiting for is actually happening. And then there she was. Lucy Hawthorne stepped down from the second car onto the platform of Millhaven Station on the 14th of June, 1884, in a dress of dark green cotton with her hair pinned up and her 2 bags in hand, and she was looking along the platform with the directness of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for. She found him. She stopped for half a second, and he saw the expression that crossed her face in that half second, which was not relief exactly, and not joy exactly, but something beneath and before both of those things, something like the settling of a long uncertainty into solid ground. She walked to him and he walked to her, and they met in the middle of the platform, and he took her bags without thinking about it and she let him. And then they stood looking at each other in the noon light with the steam from the train drifting around them. "Calvin," she said. "Lucy," he said. There were things they had said in letters that could not be said again on a train platform in front of Arthur Price and the conductor and 3 other passengers and Edmund Briggs, who had apparently come to the station for reasons that had nothing to do with collecting freight. But they were standing close enough that he could see every freckle on her nose and the way her eyes were bright and the way her hands had come to rest against his arm, and that said everything that needed saying. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well now," she said. He carried her bags to the wagon and helped her up, and as she settled into the seat she looked at the town with the expression of someone returning to a place that is genuinely, privately, deeply theirs, and that expression was the most beautiful thing Calvin had ever seen on a human face. He drove her to Mrs. Granby's boarding house, where Mrs. Granby was waiting on the porch and embraced her before she had made it through the gate, and where Elena Vargas appeared from the side of the house with Diego on her hip and a jar of preserved apricots in her free hand, and where Roberto shook Calvin's hand and then, apparently overcome, shook it again. Calvin left her to the warmth of that welcome because it was what she needed first, and because there was a specific thing he wanted to do properly and a specific place he wanted to do it, and he had waited this long, which meant he could wait until Sunday. Sunday came, which was the 16th of June, and the morning was clear and hot, and the sky was the color of a deep breath. Calvin arrived at Mrs. Granby's at 2 in the afternoon with Duchess, and a second horse borrowed from the livery, and Lucy came out in her blue cotton dress with her hair down at the sides, and a smile that she was not attempting to contain. They rode out together to his land in the easy silence of 2 people who have had 7 months of letters to practice talking, and have arrived at the place beyond words. They went to the creek first, where the cottonwoods were in full summer leaf and the water was running low and clear, and the sound of it was the best sound on the property. Lucy dismounted and stood on the bank for a moment with her boots in the grass and looked at the water, and Calvin watched her and felt the rightness of it, of her standing in this particular place on this particular ground. Then they rode to the north pasture, and the cattle were there in the afternoon heat, moving slowly, and she counted them with the proprietary interest of a person who has been told the number in many letters and wants to verify it in person. 52, she said. 52, he confirmed. Then they rode to the hill. They tied the horses at the base and walked up, and at the top the wind was there, warm and steady, and the land spread out in every direction for 4 miles. And the sky she had come from St. Louis to find, was above them without a ceiling and without an apology, enormous and blue and endlessly patient. Lucy stood at the top of the hill and breathed it in with her eyes open, and Calvin stood a step behind her and to her right, and he put his hand in his shirt pocket and turned the ring over once between his fingers. She turned to look at him and found him looking at her, and she seemed to read something in his expression because she went very still in the way she had gone still in Edmund's shop on the morning he first saw her, the stillness of a person who knows something important is happening and is choosing to meet it. He took the ring out of his pocket. He did not get down on one knee, because the hill was uneven and because he had thought about it and decided that what he wanted was to be standing in front of her, level, equal, the way they had always been. He held the ring in his open palm and she looked at it, and then at his face with those clear, river-dark eyes. "I have been carrying this since October," he said. "Since the day after you told me you went looking for the right life before the right person, and I understood what that meant." He paused, because the next part required the most words he had said in one continuous stretch in 32 years. "I am not a man who says much. You know that. But I am a man who knows when something is real and when something is only hoped for, and you are the most real thing I have ever known. I would like you to stay. Not at the boarding house here." He turned the ring in the light. "With me." Lucy looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at the sky she had traveled 1,000 miles to find, the sky that had been waiting for her. Then she looked at Calvin Walker, who had been waiting for her too in his own quiet and steady way, and she felt the rightness of everything settle into her like water settling into dry ground. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Calvin." He put the ring on her finger, and she put her hand against his face the same way she had on the platform in November. And this time she kept it there. And he covered her hand with his and looked at her. And neither of them said anything else for a long while, because the sky above them and the land below them and the warm wind around them had already said everything. He kissed her on the hill at the edge of his land, with the 4-mile view all around them and the bluebonnets still holding at the base of the slope. And she kissed him back with all the steadiness and all the warmth and all the courage that had carried her 1,000 miles from a too small city to this too large sky. And it was the best moment of his life, quietly and completely and without any question about it. They were married at the Millhaven Baptist Church on the 14th of September, 1884, 1 year and 3 days after the school board had hired Lucy Hawthorne as the town's schoolteacher. The wedding was small because both of them preferred it that way, but the church was full because Millhaven preferred a celebration and was willing to be accommodating about the distinction. Roberto and Elena Vargas sat in the front row with Diego, who was 14 months old and very interested in the flowers. Mrs. Granby wept openly and happily. Edmund Briggs baked again, this time on request, a properly enormous cake that he brought to the reception at the church hall with the pride of a man who has been useful in an important matter. Adeline Oakes made the journey from Columbus for the wedding. She arrived 3 days early and stayed with Mrs. Granby, and on the second evening Calvin invited her to supper at the house with its new room and its clean floors and its porch looking out over the flat, wide, sky-filled land. Adeline was a small, soft-spoken woman with Lucy's eyes and a quality of quiet observation that Calvin recognized because he shared it. She sat at his table and watched how he moved in his own house, how he brought Lucy her coffee first without being asked, how he listened when she spoke and answered straight when she asked him something. And over the course of the supper Calvin saw Adeline Oakes decide that her daughter had found something real, and the relief in the older woman's face was something he was glad to have given her. "You will take care of her," Adeline said to him simply at the end of the evening. "She takes care of herself," Calvin said, "but I will be beside her while she does it." Adeline looked at him for a moment with those familiar brown eyes and then smiled, and it was Lucy's smile, the full one that involved the whole face. "Yes," she said, "I think that is exactly right." The ceremony itself was conducted by the Reverend Thomas, who had been performing weddings in Millhaven for 20 years and knew how to make the words mean something. Calvin and Lucy stood facing each other at the front of the church in the September morning light, and they said their vows in the clear, unhurried voices of two people who meant them entirely. When it was done, and Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Calvin did what he had by then learned to do, which was to let what was real show on his face without trying to contain it. And Lucy looked at his face and saw it, and the smile she gave him was the most private thing he had ever been given in public. Old Pete played at the reception, and they danced, and this time Calvin danced with more confidence than adequacy, because he had been practicing in the kitchen on Saturday evenings for a month, which was something he had told no one except Duchess, who had watched through the window without comment. They moved into the house on the Walker land that afternoon. The new room was Lucy's by natural right. She had chosen the curtains and the desk beside the window, and Calvin had built bookshelves into the east wall because she had brought books and more books, and he wanted her books to have good homes. In their first year of marriage, Lucy continued teaching at the Millhaven school, and Calvin ran his cattle operation with the growing confidence of a man whose land was healthy and whose work was good. She was a formidable partner in the practical matters of the land, having absorbed 6 months of his letters with serious attention, and having her own considerable intelligence to apply to problems. She suggested that the North Pasture rotation schedule was inefficient, sketched out an alternative on a piece of paper at the kitchen table, and turned out to be correct. He implemented it without argument, because he was a man who recognized a better idea when he saw one. Their first spring together in that house was the kind of spring that stays in a person for the rest of their life. The bluebonnets came in along the creek in April with the particular extravagance of a good year, thick and blue all the way to the base of the hill, and they went out one evening and walked through them while the sun was going down, and the air smelled of cedar and grass and the coming warmth of summer. Lucy walked beside him with her hand in his, and they were quiet together in the good way, the way he had learned to tell from the empty way, and the silence was full and warm and entirely his. She told him in May of 1885, in the kitchen over coffee on a Saturday morning, that she believed she might be expecting. Calvin set down his coffee cup with a very precise movement and looked at her. She was watching him with that careful measuring expression she had first used in Edmund's leather shop, the one that evaluated whether information could be trusted. And he understood she was watching him because this was large news, and she wanted to see how it landed. It landed in the center of his chest like something warm and bright, like the first genuinely hot day of summer after a long spring. He looked at her and felt the weight and the wonder of it and put his hand over hers on the table. When he managed, "January, I think," she said. "I want to see the doctor to be certain." "January," he said. He turned that over. "January, a winter baby." He thought about the house and the warmth of the stove and the new room and the way the light came in through the east window in the morning, and about the particular quality of a winter that has something new and alive at the center of it. "You are happy," she said, reading his face. "I am trying to find a word large enough," he said, and she laughed and leaned across the table and kissed him. The doctor confirmed it. January was correct. Lucy continued teaching until November, when the school board and Roberto's wife Alina united in the opinion that she ought to rest, and Lucy accepted this with the pragmatic grace of a woman who knows when to delegate. Mrs. Belton returned from Fredericksburg for the final months of the school year, and Billy Pratt, who was now 14 and had developed a genuine passion for mathematics, helped organize the younger students' reading time with a gravity that made Lucy laugh every time she heard about it. Calvin Walker's son was born on the 8th of January, 1886, in the bedroom of the house on Walker Land, delivered by Dr. Haskell and assisted by Alina Vargas and Mrs. Granby, who had both arrived the previous evening with covered dishes and the intention of being useful. Calvin sat in the kitchen through most of it with Roberto, who had been through this with Alina, and was therefore theoretically the voice of experienced calm, but who was actually nearly as agitated as Calvin. When Dr. Haskell opened the door and told him he could come in, Calvin walked into the bedroom and found his wife sitting up against the pillows with the particular exhausted radiance that belongs only to that specific hour, and she was holding their son. The baby was small and red and furious about being in the world, and Calvin sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him, this new person, and Lucy shifted him gently into Calvin's arms. He had never held a newborn before, and he was deeply aware of the weight of this fact as he held his child for the first time, the impossible lightness and the impossible weight of him simultaneously. "Hello," Calvin said to his son, and the baby opened one eye briefly and then went back to being furious, and Lucy laughed softly, and Alina and Mrs. Granby made warm sounds from the doorway, and Roberto appeared behind them with an expression of profound emotional investment. "James," Lucy said quietly. "I would like to call him James, after my father." Calvin looked at his wife. "James Walker," he said, and it sounded right and true and like the name of a person who would grow up well. "Yes," he said, "that's a good name." James Walker grew into the world with the vigor of a healthy boy and the attentiveness of a child who had two parents who talked to him like he was a person from the very beginning. He had Lucy's brown eyes and Calvin's stubborn jaw, and very early on, a disposition that was curious about everything, which they both encouraged in every way they could. Lucy returned to teaching the following fall, when James was 9 months old, and Elena Vargas had offered, with genuine enthusiasm, to look after him on teaching days. The arrangement suited everyone, and James grew up with Diego Vargas as his closest companion, the two of them inseparable in the particular way of children who have grown up together from the beginning. In the spring of 1888, Lucy told Calvin over breakfast that she thought they might be expecting again. Their daughter, Clara, was born in October of that year, in the same bedroom, delivered by the same Dr. Haskell, and she arrived with a great deal less difficulty than her brother and a great deal more immediate calm, looking around the room with wide, already observant eyes from the very first minutes. James, who was 2.5 and had been told for months that a baby was coming, sat beside his mother on the bed and looked at Clara with the solemn authority of someone who intended to take the responsibility of older brotherhood very seriously. "Small," he said. "She will not always be," Calvin told him, sitting on his other side. James considered this. "Will she be able to ride?" "When she is old enough," Lucy said. James nodded, satisfied, as though this confirmed the baby's worthiness. The years that followed were full years, the kind that only sound ordinary when described but are in fact the substance of everything. The Walker land grew. Calvin expanded the cattle operation steadily and carefully, never beyond what the land could support, always with an eye toward building something that would last. Lucy continued to teach, and the school grew as Millhaven grew, and she took on a second teacher, a young woman named Margaret who reminded Lucy somewhat of her younger self, and she mentored her with the same directness and genuine care that she brought to everything. Billy Pratt grew up and left Millhaven for the University of Texas at Austin, where he studied engineering, and he wrote Lucy a letter from there that she kept, which said that she was the reason he had understood that being intelligent was something to be proud of rather than something to apologize for. She read that letter to Calvin in the evening on the porch, and he watched her face while she read it, and thought that she was the same person who had stood in Edmund's leather shop 10 years before, and then thought that she was not the same person at all. She was more herself now, settled deeper into what she was, and it was the finest thing he had ever seen happen to anyone. Adeline Oakes came from Columbus every summer. She was a changed woman from the hesitant, grief-worn person Lucy had returned to in November of 1883, changed by the slow work of rebuilding a life on one's own terms, which Adeline had managed with more resilience than Lucy had initially given her credit for. She liked to sit on the Walker porch in the evenings and watch her grandchildren running in the long summer light, and occasionally said things to Calvin that were so unexpectedly wise and dry that he had to work to keep his expression neutral. "I worried about her, you know," Adeline said to him one summer evening when Lucy had taken James and Clara inside for bedtime. "When she left for Texas, I thought she was running away from something." "Was she?" Calvin asked. "No," Adeline said thoughtfully. "She was running towards something. She always knew what it was. I just could not see it from where I was standing. She was quiet for a moment. I can see it now." Calvin looked out at the land that had been his for 15 years and that bore the marks of both of them now. The bookshelves in the new room and the kitchen garden Lucy had put in along the south wall, and the second barn he had built with Roberto, and the swing he had hung from the cottonwood by the creek for James and Clara. He thought about standing on a train platform in November of 1883, watching a train leave with the woman he loved, and about the ring in his pocket, and about standing on the same platform in May of 1884, watching a train arrive and not arrive, and about the tears on his face in the afternoon light. He thought about the hill and the sky and the turquoise ring and her saying yes. He thought about James Walker asleep in the house, and Clara asleep beside him, and Lucy coming back out onto the porch in a few minutes, as she always did, to sit with him in the evening. "I think," Calvin said carefully, "that the things worth having are the ones that require you to be patient enough to deserve them." Adeline looked at him for a moment and then made a sound that was both agreement and affection. "She chose well," she said. "So did I," Calvin said simply. Lucy came back out onto the porch and sat in the chair beside his, and he reached over without looking away from the land and took her hand, and she turned her hand over and held his, the way she had the first evening on this porch all those years ago when they had been something new and uncertain and entirely possible. The land was settled and green in the late summer evening. The creek made its sound at the bottom of the slope. The sky above the hills was going from gold to rose to the deep, final blue that had been the color she had come 1,000 miles to find, and it was there every evening, enormous and indifferent to small fears and permanent beyond any individual life, and beneath it the two of them sat in the warm dark together and were still. In the autumn of 1891, the county school board voted to name the Millhaven School building the Hawthorne School, in recognition of Lucy Walker's 8 years of teaching and her service to the community. She was presented with a framed certificate at a town meeting that was attended by every family in the county who could make the ride, and she accepted it with the composed directness she brought to everything. And then, afterward, standing with Calvin in the yard outside the courthouse, put her face against his shoulder for a moment in a way that was entirely private and entirely unguarded. He put his arm around her. She was 33 years old. She had come to Millhaven 8 years ago on pure courage with nothing but a dead woman's address and the intention of building a life worth living, and she had built it, stone by stone and year by year, and it was good. It was genuinely and permanently good. James was 5 years old that fall and had recently decided that the best occupation in the world was riding, a conclusion he had reached after spending a summer watching his father work cattle from the saddle. Calvin had given him his first proper riding lesson in the summer, and James had taken to it with the single-minded intensity of a child who has found his element. Clara, who was 3, watched her brother's lessons with the focused assessment of someone planning to demand the same lessons as soon as the opportunity presented itself, which she did, with complete success. 6 months later, Roberto and Alina's family had grown to 4 children by then, and the Vargas and Walker children formed a small tribe on the neighboring properties, riding and running and creating elaborate games among the creek and the hills that involved rules that only they fully understood. Calvin watched them sometimes from the fence line, these children who were growing up in the good silence, in the kind of space that was not empty but full. And he thought about his own childhood on this same plain land, the 2 years after his father died when he had been 16 and entirely alone, and he found that the thought did not hurt the way it once had. It had been shaped into something bearable by everything that had come after it, by the weight and warmth and reality of what he had built on top of it. Lucy found him at the fence one evening watching the children, and she came and stood beside him and looked at the same thing. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, putting words to something that lived mostly below language. "I am thinking," he said, "that I used to believe a solitary life was simply the only life available to me, and now I cannot imagine having settled for that." She was quiet beside him, listening in the way she listened, completely. "I am thinking," he continued, "that everything worth having required me to wait, and that the waiting was worth every single day of it." She looked up at him, and the evening light was in her eyes and on her face, and she was 33 years old and they had been married 7 years, and she was as real and as true and as entirely present as she had been on the first day he saw her, and more so, because there were 7 years of shared life giving texture and depth to every line of her face. "We have a good life, Calvin," she said. "We have the best life," he said. He said it simply and without ceremony, the way you say a thing that is simply true, and she leaned into his side and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the fence while the children played, and the sun went down over the Walker land in the enormous West Texas sky, and everything that had been broken or empty or uncertain in either of their lives had arrived at this place, this evening, this quiet and complete and permanent now. The bluebonnets came back every spring along the creek, as they always did, faithful as the season itself. And every year when they came in thick and blue and extravagant, Calvin and Lucy walked through them together, sometimes with James and Clara running ahead, and sometimes alone in the early morning before the children were awake. And Lucy always stopped in the middle of them and looked up at the sky with the same expression she had worn on that first hill at the edge of the property, the expression of a woman who has found the sky she came for and knows it and is glad. He loved her for that expression. He loved her for all of it, for the composure and the courage and the directness and the laugh, and the way she filled his house and his land and his life with something he had not known he was missing, until she walked into Edmund Briggs's leather shop on a Tuesday morning in April of 1883, and turned around with brown eyes and 3 freckles on the bridge of her nose, and looked at him like she was deciding whether his information could be trusted. He hoped it could be trusted. He believed it had been. He believed, standing in the spring sun with the bluebonnets all around him and his wife's hand in his, and the sound of his children's voices carrying across the creek, that every solitary year and every hard winter and every long and patient wait had been the exactly correct price for this, for all of this, and that he would have paid it again without a moment's hesitation. Calvin Walker, who had been carved from limestone and raised on grit, and had ridden 32 years of West Texas life without once shedding a tear, had wept on a train platform on a May afternoon in 1884, and he was glad of it. He was glad because it had shown him what was real and what he was capable of and what he had to lose, and because a man who cannot weep for what he loves has not yet understood what he has. He understood what he had. He understood it completely and clearly and without any remaining doubt. He had Lucy Hawthorne, who had become Lucy Walker, who was standing beside him in the bluebonnets on a spring morning in 1892, with her face turned up to the sky. She had traveled 1,000 miles to find, and she was here, and he was here, and the sky above them was the color of the stone in her ring, and everything else was silence of the very best kind.